Okay, I thought what I'd do today is go through a quick demo of different kinds of knife cuts. I'm going to be using my 185 millimeter Bunka. This is a white number 2 steel, and that's super sharp, so it really shows off the cutting capacity well. For the test cutting today, I'm going to be using celery just because I have a lot of that. And I think that celery is also a really good show of knife skills because it's a little bit more fibrous, and it's not something that's going to be just super easy to cut no matter what you do, the way that, say, a potato might be, for example. Okay. Now, the first thing that you want to do whenever you sit down and start prepping some vegetables is think about how you want to hold the knife. Broadly speaking, there are 2 grips. Okay. So the first grip is what's sometimes called the European method, or sometimes it's called the handshake method. And you literally just hold the knife like this. You just kind of ham-hand it. And you just grip the knife like that, right? And then you're gonna chop and slice and whatever. This is a really intuitive way to hold the knife. I would say that it's the grip that most people use before they get any kind of training. And then the second type of grip is one that's much more common in Asia, particularly in Japan. And that is called the pinch grip. It's called the pinch grip because you grip the knife by coming up, and then you literally, let me bring that in a little bit, you literally pinch the blade between your thumb on one side and then the index finger on the other side. The advantage of the pinch grip is I'm kind of choking up on the knife blade, and that puts my center of control further along on that knife blade, and it gets me a little bit more control, so that when I'm manipulating the knife, you're always going to manipulate it from your wrist, because your wrist is what's going to move. Your arm is going to move, obviously, but your wrist is really important while you are cutting anything. And so moving your wrist up just changes the way that that knife is going to move, right? The pinch grip is also useful because while you got this positive control on the blade, you can keep the blade a little bit more stiff. That helps out if the blade is a little bit thinner, right? So European blades typically are thicker, and so you don't necessarily need that extra little bit of stiffness. But then if you're working with something like a Japanese knife, that edge is going to be much slimmer. It's going to have just a little bit of play. That's going to depend on the hardness of the steel, the alloy of the steel, the heat treatment. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into that. But if you want just that little bit more confidence that the blade isn't going to flex while you're cutting with it, then you want a pinch grip, right? Typically, I pinch grip. You can even tell that Asian style knives are typically meant to be pinch gripped, right? And you can kind of tell that because there's a gap right here, and that is meant to accommodate the fingers, right? So that I can pinch grip in, and it's actually very and it's actually very comfortable to do that. Okay, so the first of the basic types of knife skills is the chop. The chop is the most common knife skill used in Asian cooking, and it's characterized by an up and down motion. So we take the food, and you're literally just going up and down. All right. If you want to get a little bit faster with the chop, it really helps to take something like a piece of celery, get it to where it's a little bit smaller, right? And then what you can do is you take your thumb on the end of the piece of food, and then when you just literally push the food through with your thumb, as you're chopping. And then this is kind of a learned thing, and you're just pushing it ever so slightly as you're going through the food. And you kind of just learn this as a muscle memory thing, right? So then I can take this. You tend to slow down a little bit once you get down to the nub. So at that point, usually it's always going to be a little bit slow, but really the best thing that you can do is keep to your basic technique, right? Curl your fingers in. It helps a little bit to be on the tip of the knife here, and you can just cut through. Okay. So that's chopping, right? And then the next form of cutting is sometimes called push cutting, right? It's called push cutting because you're going to take the knife and you're literally just going to push the knife through, right? So it's push, push, push. And otherwise, it's a pretty similar motion. The big difference is, of course, this horizontal action that I have going on. So push cutting like this is really useful because the straight up and down chopping really relies on the sharpness of the blade. When you have a really sharp blade, especially if you have a little bit of a heavier blade, the chopping is nice, it's easy, it goes through the food. If the knife is not extremely sharp, then chopping becomes very inefficient and actually is extremely bad for the food because that knife is just going to wedge itself through the food. If you think about something like an onion and you think about that, it's kind of fibrous, it's very layered, it's super thick. Dull knives go into an onion and they just got a chunk, and then you end up doing things like you put your hand on the knife and you have to like slam on it and you're trying to get through that way. That's no good. If you're at that point, you can't chop through the food like that. That's inefficient. You're just mauling up the food, right? So at that point, you want to work with the knife and again, like putting in just that little bit of sideways motion. It really works, right? I am just barely putting any pressure down on the knife. And what's really nice about a push cut is you're using the entire, well, maybe not the entire, but you're using more of the width of the blade. So you're wearing that blade more evenly. People who do a lot of chopping will usually wear down one part of the knife faster than the rest of the knife, and so that one point is going to become less sharp, and because it's concentrated in that one place, you're going to dull that knife even faster, right? So when you're pushing through the food, you're distributing that cut along the entire blade, and that makes it easier on the knife. Depending on the food, you can also get a much better cut, because if you think about something like celery, right, you've got all of this fibrous material to cut through, but the fibers are running vertically, right? So you're cutting crosswise to the fibers, so you're cutting those fibers up as you go. And in meat as well as in vegetable, that is going to keep the food more tender. It's going to be easier for you to eat, right? The third major way of cutting is called the draw slice, right? So it's called a draw slice because you, instead of pushing, okay, you're going to kind of pull the blade. Or in cutting terms, instead of pulling the blade, we call that drawing the blade, right? So most times in European cooking, you're going to see a draw cut because you're going to start partway into the food, okay? And then what French people like to do is they like to just draw the knife through, and you can get interesting presentations that way. Okay, so if you want a food that you've cut into like a Y shape, then you're going to draw slice that, right? Because if you are push cutting that, you don't get as much precision. This point where you insert the knife on a push cut is going to be really difficult to keep that precise as well as quick, right? With the draw slice, I just push the knife in and then I draw through. So the point of insertion is always set. This is very, very, very precise. So I can make this separation as long as I want it to be, or as short as I want it to be. And you can achieve different kinds of decorative effects that way, right? So drawing through the food, you can do that just to cut through. Let me okay. So I can just draw through like that, okay? This is not gonna be terribly efficient. Again, drawing is a really nice way to just enjoy the sharpness of a blade, because when you're drawing through food, you can really feel that blade. You can really feel it work. When you're drawing, one thing that you want to remember is keep the food still, and it's only the knife that moves. Only the knife. It's slow, right? Which is one reason typically when you're draw slicing, you want to draw slice when you want just a little bit of precision, and you don't necessarily want to do that for all of your prep. You don't want to do this for all of your cutting, because just imagine how long that's going to take. What most Europeans are going to do to achieve speed is they're going to do what's sometimes called the regular slice, the plain slice, or sometimes it's called rock chopping, and it's the vertical motion. It's going to be really difficult, because if you see my blade geometry here, I really prefer chopping knives, and to chop well, you need to have a flat part of the belly. So this knife is really made for chopping and draw slicing, right? You can tell that it's made for draw slicing because it has a very pronounced tip, and that helps me get into the food. And then it's meant for chopping because it's got all of this flat part here. In a European style chef knife, the tip would be more rounded, and then it's meant to just rock kind of like that, right? So it's going to be, I don't know if I'm going to get a whole lot of, yeah, it doesn't work terribly well. A little bit. I'm actually, I don't know if you can tell this on the camera, but I'm actually kind of cutting a little bit disturbing lines into my cutting board here. The knife is actually going distressingly deep into the cutting board, and I'm actually cutting a groove into it. That's not great. But that's going to be your rocking cut. It tends to be very precise because the knife is actually making contact with the cutting board, and if you have a knife that curves up at the tip like that, you're keeping one point of contact with the knife here, so the knife is kind of anchored. And then again, it's kind of different in that instead of the knife being the only thing that moves and the food stays still, when you're rocking, you're actually keeping that knife anchored to the cutting board at the tip. So the knife is basically stationary and the food moves. You just push the food through with your free hand, and you process it that way, right? So it's a very different philosophy of cutting. I will say, even though I don't use that technique a whole lot, it is probably one of the faster, or maybe it's the fastest technique for chopping fine herbs. So if you're working through cilantro, you want to get through a lot of parsley, something like that. Definitely, like, rocking your way through that is a great choice. And even if you like Asian knives, I think that getting through those herbs is is a good reason to have a European style rounded belly chef knife, because that's a knife that's really well suited to that kind of work if you're processing large amounts of those herbs. If you're just doing a small amount of those herbs, then probably your better bet is to use a petty knife or possibly even a paring knife. And the petty knife or the paring knife just has to be really nice, really sharp, so that you're not just wedging your way through the herbs. And that your nightmare scenario there is that, again, you're just crushing the food. And when you crush the food like that, you're going to let out a lot of liquid, and you don't really want that. You don't want to leave all of that liquid on the cutting board, right? Okay, this has been a quick demo. I hope that this makes you think about your knives a little bit differently, and I hope that, you know, if there's a technique here today that that you haven't used as much, yeah, give it a try. Always fun to be had in the kitchen.